I'm Hannah from Answer the Public. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a quick reminder of what our webinar series is all about. So every month we talk to experts from a range of different fields. It might be from creative or SEO. They might be a specialist in health, like Julia on our webinar today. But what we're talking to them about is how you can use search data to read people's minds and make better business decisions. So we will be showing you and talking about some different tools and methods that you can use to get the best out of your search listening. But this isn't an Answer the Public tutorial, but we do have one of those over on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/answerthepublic, as well as all of the recordings from our past webinars as well, if you wanted to check those out. So house rules, really simple. Just make sure you ask us lots of questions. So there will be a time for a Q&A at the end of the session today. But if there is anything that's pertinent to something that Sophie and Julia are talking about during the webinar session, I'll try and jump in and get that question answered for you. But also share on Twitter as well. We'd love for you to get involved in any conversations. Our hashtag is search listening. And I'll just pause on this slide for 1 second so that you can grab our Twitter handles if you wanted to connect as well. Julia Walsh is at Medicine Brand, and her website is brandmedicine.com.au. We are Answer the Public. Our Twitter handle is at Answer the Public, very simply. And I'm at Hannah M. Foster. And Sophie is at Search Listening, and her Twitter handle is at Coley Bird. Today's conversation is all about exploring the patient journey and Dr.Google. We're joined by Julia from Brand Medicine International and Sophie from Search Listening. So guys, it'd be really good if I could get you to introduce yourself. So I've paused on this slide here because this is Julia's book, which she's just launched, and it's called What We Really Asked Dr.Google, Healthcare Insights in the Digital Age. It'd be great to hear a bit about your background, Julia, and how you became a published author in search listening in the healthcare sphere.
Thank you, Hannah. A lot of that journey has really been inspired by the work of your team and Sophie's discoveries and training as well in this space, which I discovered about 18 months ago or so. And my background is I originally studied as a scientist, and then I have worked in healthcare communications for the last 20 years or so. And one of the things I've observed over the time that the internet has really become integral to healthcare is that we've missed an opportunity as an industry to sit beside our stakeholders, whether they're patients or healthcare professionals, and actually really understand what that information journey is that they undertake when they turn to the internet to exchange questions for health advice. And so what I wanted to explore with the search listening when it I became aware of it is aggregating those anonymized search queries and then analyzing them around any particular seed term just reveals the most incredible insights for health. And the reason why is because health is something that for so many of us is private, especially at different particular points along that patient journey. And so that's what I started studying, and then I started developing a methodology to adapt Sophie's wonderful work across to how that might look if you're undertaking a strategic search listening analysis in healthcare. And then pretty much started writing it down. And that's how it ended up becoming the book that I published last week.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was a great introduction. I'm just going to pass you on now to Sophie. So Sophie is also a published author. Sophie is a regular guest on our webinars. Actually, I should mention that Julia has also been on one of our previous webinars. So we did an intro into search listening in healthcare, which was a great session, and that's over on the YouTube channel as well if you wanted to check that one out. I'll send that to you in the follow-up notes. But Sophie is a regular guest on our webinars, and she has become one of the lead influencers in search listening in the world, I suppose we should say. So Sophie, yeah, it'd be great if you could give us a bit of an introduction into how you got into search listening and how this led to writing your book, Consumer Insight in the Age of Google.
Yeah, sure. So I, maybe 15 years ago now, trained as a journalist and left university and thought I'd go into journalism. I happened to fall into marketing, and in particular search marketing, not really knowing very much about search marketing or how it works, but what I've always said is I've really retained that kind of, as I call it, nosiness around people. I guess the more proper way of saying that is curiosity. I find people fascinating, and I think the more I worked with search data, the more I realised that actually you can learn an incredible amount about people just by looking at their search and their search behaviour, and in particular the search suggestions that you get from Google. So not necessarily when we talk about search data, I don't always mean, although it can mean, the sorts of keywords that you get out of the tool, like the keyword planner, which are typically quite commercial, but it's those Google search suggestions, which is the data that AnswerThePublic scrapes, that can be really telling, really revealing, really candid. So yeah, I've been working in search marketing for getting on 12 years now, but in director of strategy at my agency now, and a lot of my work is inspired by this idea of search listening, which is a term that I guess we started using a couple of years ago in the hope that we can spur more people to start using search data, perhaps in a way that social data is quite often used. So there's a big industry around search listening, and I'm trying to make that happen with search, really, because I believe that data has so much potential. Yeah, I've written the book. Searchlistening.com has lots of stuff on it, including sort of training courses and free resources as well. And that's, yeah, how Julia and I connected brilliantly. She did all the training and has just absolutely run with it in the healthcare space. So I'm really excited for our sort of second webinar today to chat through some of her thinking, which is an evolution of the more commercial application of search listening, if you like.
Great, thanks so much, guys. And I will drop the links to your books in the chat as well. So if anyone is interested in checking them out, they can have a look at those. Okay, so let's dive into the first questions. And I think, Sophie, you're going to set us off with this one. So how do customer journeys play out in search? It'd be really interesting to hear about that.
Yeah, so I suppose the useful or interesting thing here that I hope it's useful to people attending is the idea that actually you can map any customer journey to search behaviours. So I guess when I started trying to theorise around search listening a little bit better, started a very basic customer journey. I'm super appreciative of the fact that probably everybody on this webinar today will work in a different field, will have different kind of customer or user journeys that you work to. So I do work off a very simplified basic one, with the point being that you can absolutely tailor this to any sort of journey that works for your organisation, your goals and your business. But if you think about a journey that kind of starts off with a trigger, so something happens in someone's life that causes them to go off and do something, right? It could be stubbing your toe, it could be your car breaking down, it could be getting a headache, it could be seeing a certain advert. There will always be a trigger at the start of a journey. And actually triggers are a huge driver of search. I think if you think to the examples that I just listed, I don't know, if you stub your toe, you might get your phone out and Google, how do I know if I've broken my toe? If your car breaks down, you might Google something like, is it bad if there's smoke coming from the bonnet of my car? But so often, I think because of the ease, the immediacy, the kind of guarantee that we know that we will get good information most of the time, not always, when we Google, a trigger will happen in our offline world, if you like, out there in the real world, and a lot of the time we will turn to Google immediately in that moment. Moving on in the journey, you've got awareness. It may be that you're made aware of a brand, you see an advert, your friend tells you about this amazing new product that they've bought, whatever it is, somehow you're made aware. And again, that's quite often a trigger, if you like, that you might turn to search. You might get your phone out, you might get your computer out, and you might Google that brand or that product because you've been made aware and you're suddenly quite interested. And we see those sorts of searches happening. Moving it on further, and this is in a very commercial sense, consideration. We see a lot of searches where people are comparing two things, and it gets quite interesting. Certainly in the tech world, you'll see things like iPhone 13 versus iPhone 10, or versus an iPhone versus Samsung, all sorts of things where people are trying to make a decision and they're comparing two things. And anyone who uses AnswerThePublic will see that there is that comparison wheel, which is super useful when you're exploring that kind of more consideration phase. If you shift it along further, there's a conversion phase. You'll see searches there where you might see people looking for discounts, those sorts of things, because they want to buy from you, but they just want to do it at a cheaper price. And interestingly, I think once you get past that conversion point, again, I'm talking about a very commercial journey here, just to set the scene. We will move into how this applies to health shortly. Once you've got that customer, you in a traditional marketing funnel, you would expect to get some loyalty and some advocacy from a portion of your customers. What's interesting here is that actually those are spaces where search doesn't play out so well, because search is anonymous. It's effectively a conversation that you're having with Google. And in some ways, the anonymity that you're granted from that is a real strength at the earlier stages of the journey. But once you've got that thing, there's no point you telling Google that your product's great. You don't need to convince Google, you need to convince the other people in your life. Yeah, I think what's interesting, and what I'd always encourage people to do, and this is a lot of the work I do in my consultancy around search listening, is thinking about those journeys that your customers go on, and really exploring search data to plot it at every stage along here, because you'll absolutely be able to do that, and it will start to enable you to use search data perhaps in a slightly more strategic way when you're thinking about actually what can I use here. And for me, triggers is the big one. Yeah, there are countless new reasons all the time why someone would search, and as I said, largely they do turn into searches, so it's really interesting. So yeah, my work focuses a lot more in the commercial world, and I've trained up a lot of kind of commercial businesses, but I think, like I said earlier, I've loved, in this weird pandemic world we've been in the past couple of years, getting to know Julia, obviously virtually, from the other side of the world, and the work that she's really done to take this kind of commercial journey thinking and apply it to the healthcare world. And I guess what I would hope people take away from this webinar is that no matter what you work in, whether you're in B2B, whether you're in not-for-profit, health, anything, there will be a journey that your customers, your users, your stakeholders go on, and you'll be able to plot searches. As much as you can't identify people from their searches, from anonymized search data, you'll be able to plot their behaviors to different points along the journey, and that's a really useful task or process to go through.
Thanks, Sophie. So then moving it on, that was a really brilliant insight into a customer journey, and it's just already making me think about myself and how I search around health, anything related to like vaccine questions, or it might be an ailment that I've had myself, or perhaps if someone in my family has got sick, we can all identify with that and know that we turn to Google as a first point of call to get that information. Julia, I guess this is handed over to you now. So how do customer journeys then translate into health, and why is it that people rely on so heavily on what you've coined Dr.Google for health advice?
Thank you, Hannah. And I think what you said about it's not just when you're talking about your own health, it's other family members. So in a carer's role as well, there's a lot of stakeholders that use search data when it comes to health. So from the doctors to the patients to the carers. In terms of patients, the reason why they turn to Dr.Google for that health advice is because they are really trying to fill the gaps from that consultation that they had with their doctor. A lot of the time when you're in that consultation, if you get bad news, all you hear from that point forward is just white noise, and especially if it's technical terms as well. So I see a lot of patients coming home from what was probably a doctor's appointment and turning to the internet and going, what does Menzies mean? Or what does this, all of the technical terms that might be used during a consultation that is day-to-day language for a healthcare professional is completely lost on the patient a lot of the time. So they will turn to a search engine to try and seek a better understanding and get back control over their life, where they feel like this diagnosis has upended everything and taken away their sense of security around their whole just well-being. So Sophie's work with the customer journey really inspired me, particularly one of the things I think where I started, which was actually towards the sort of acceptance stage in a way, is that she talked about when someone has a product that belongs to them, they'll talk about my car or my cat or, you know, my holiday. And that's where I started to realize that people actually use the same approach when they're asking Dr.Google for health advice about some disease that they have. And so when I started to look at that, then I stepped back and went, oh, let's look at all of the other stages of the patient journey. And as Sophie said, you have these external triggers in the real world. So it might be for awareness, it could be that you've got a hereditary disease like hemophilia or something like that. You're thinking about having a child. You want to understand, is that going to affect a girl or just a boy? Is it always transmitted to the offspring? What are the risks and things like that? From a symptom point of view, it's really important to understand search data around a lot of health categories because of the private nature of health. A lot of the time, symptoms can feel quite personal and embarrassing potentially as well. And so what I have discovered through basically being an internet explorer for the last 18 months around health categories is that People do turn to search engines to explore and understand these things, but the language that they use isn't necessarily what we assume that they use. And I think that's where the digital disconnect arises between what the healthcare industry is creating and publishing and then what patients are discovering online. And that's a big part of my work, actually, is not just understanding the questions that they ask, but following it through to the content that is served back to them. So essentially mapping that patient information experience, because at the end of the day, that whole journey and how they're influenced by that content that comes back to them, that's what basically is impacting the offline healthcare ecosystem, because it drives from a diagnosis point of view. Certainly people turn to the internet and seek to understand more about the disease, how they can get the best treatment, who the best doctor is. A lot of the time, and I try to really always approach my work with a huge dose of empathy. A lot of the time, one of the first questions they ask is, will whatever the disease is kill me? So people are taking their greatest fears and confessing that into Google. And I think that gives us a really big insight as to the need for greater empathy along the way of not just the in-consultation experience with the healthcare professional offline, but in terms of the kind of information we design for patients and offer them online. From a treatment point of view, I've discovered pretty consistently across different surveys and polls that I've taken that 8 out of 10 people, when they're prescribed a medication, go online and look it up. And that has a massive impact in relation to their relationship with that medication. If the content that is served back to them is basically focusing on side effects and adverse events, or the first thing that pops up is a review or a blog about something, it can really distort their perception of the value of that product versus the risk. And so it actually drives their behavior. It can end up causing a lot of what I call, what's referred to as primary non-adherence. So they get prescribed that medication because their doctor sees that they need it. They go and they maybe fill the prescription, and then they come home and they look it up, and then they go, oh, I'm not touching that. And it remains unopened in their cupboard. In fact, if you go to Bing and you look up any product and you look at the bar along the top, it starts with side effects, warnings, contraindications. It eventually gets to indications, which isn't even patient language. Or a lot of the consumer medical information is written in a way where it would say, how does it work? But on Bing, it just says indications. So there's a lot of negative things to get through around a medication before you even get to what it's used for. And when patients are viewing that through their own lens and they don't necessarily understand the risk of their disease, like high cholesterol or high blood pressure, they undertake their own risk-benefit analysis and just decide not to take the medication. So understanding the questions that they ask around the treatment is really important. And then resolution is when they move on and the disease becomes something in their past, a past experience. They hope that they won't get it again. And it's like what Sophie was saying about the advocacy part. This is where you can get your patient advocates, the people who can speak about their positive experience, and they become champions in a category for helping other patients to have a positive journey, and they move more into a social platform.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was really interesting. So what then about the less functional but more emotional journeys?
So I was just going to jump in here, because this is, for me, the really fascinating stuff. And it's, like I said, starting in a really commercial place with search listening, and then seeing the way that I guess Julia has taken a more functional journey in the healthcare world and really made it apply there. It's really interesting. But when you start digging into kind of the psychological and emotional reasons that people search and the behaviours that you'll see at different stages, it's absolutely fascinating. And yeah, so much of this just really rings true. I hope people are sat at home or in their offices nodding along to this, because I always watch it and listen to the examples that Julia gives. And I've definitely been that person who's got some medication and Googled it. I have to say, I don't think I've had the awful experience of reading something awful and not taking it, but I can totally imagine that how that would happen. But yeah, the emotional side of it all is just super fascinating to explore. I'm very lucky sort of sneak preview of Julia's book, and I think it's definitely one of the highlights of that.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, so it was zooming back out from that acceptance stage where it's talking about my disease and when you use that as a seed term, that's where you find all of your patients. Every question potentially returned by Answer the Public to a seed term that has my in front of it, it reveals all of the questions around the patients in that category, and it's absolutely fascinating. Zooming back from that, I guess what became really clear to me is when I looked at the content that a lot of the patients are being served back to them online at the moment, is that there really is a need to do a better job of turning up for them in the right mindset so that the content resonates with them. I was working on something recently where a disease where people don't think that it's necessarily something that's going to get a patient emotionally upset about having it. They are actually turning online and saying that this disease is making them feel suicidal. And if I look at the answers that they're getting, I'm like, oh my goodness, these poor patients, there's nothing on that page turning up for them in that moment of need. And the other thing is, if you think about the kinds of reasons that people are triggered to search online as well, is going back earlier in this stages of grief, which I've adapted a little bit for healthcare based on what I'm discovering online as well. So I've zoomed some extra things in there, like the shock and the fear part of it. But at the very beginning, when they have a symptom and they look it up, they've got this denial. They think something as serious as breast cancer or as serious as prostate cancer is probably not going to happen to them. So you get this optimism bias weigh in on that experience when they look up that symptom. So what happens when they find content is that they'll gravitate towards something that allows them or gives them permission to brush it off and get on with their day and feel fine. And the reason why I think this is really important to understand and to intersect as a healthcare industry is because even in 2021, so many patients have been diagnosed really late with diseases. And we know that actually from the very beginning of having symptoms, they were searching about those symptoms online. So what is it about that online search experience that is causing them not to act? Is letting them walk away from that interaction online to just get on with their lives and ignore the symptoms. The other thing that happens is that people Google one symptom at a time, and a disease is often diagnosed by a prodrome of different symptoms. And so that's another thing that perverts the content that's coming back to them as well. And I think another thing that's playing into why people are still being diagnosed so late. So if we have tools that can turn up for patients early in a disease cycle, that maybe give them a survey to ask them about the other symptoms they might be experiencing, or find a way to encourage them to just have that conversation with their doctor, or even call a healthcare professional and do an online telehealth consult that might be less of a barrier to act, just so that they can go, okay, maybe I should get that blood test, or maybe I should get that x-ray. And then I think overall, and this is my big, hairy, audacious goal with this work, is that we can actually improve the patient journey for so many patients around the world by improving the online information experience for them and accelerating that pathway towards diagnosis and ultimately treatment. Because if we can do that, they won't be turning up so late in that journey, and they won't have such diseases that are more progressed are obviously so much harder to treat, and then they have a much worse outcome. Down the bottom here, I've also captured the kind of information that they need at these different stages. So as we're creating a lot of the agencies I worked in, we always collaborated with a consumer writer and a medical writer to create content for patients online. I almost feel like we need a third person overseeing that, and that's someone who's got the psychological lens to understand the mindset of the patient and ensure that they are actually really creating the content that's going to connect and encourage that person to move to the next stage in a positive way. So were there any questions about this stage?
Yeah, we have had one question through from Angela. So Angela's asked, have you been able to pass out any age differences in your work? So Angela's saying, I feel like my younger patients start at the fear stage, but not necessarily my older patients. I wonder what you found about that, Julia.
Interesting. So with the segmentation of people looking at content online and asking those questions, that was something that at the beginning I was like, oh, how do we know who's asking what? The way they ask the question and the type of disease they're asking about can often give that away. The more technical questions are very often healthcare professionals, and while some people might think that doctors don't turn to Google, I can guarantee you that very much they do, and all of the time. For patients, it does depend on the disease they're asking about. So, for example, if they're asking about acne, that can obviously be someone at the younger stage versus asking about alcoholism, which is probably someone who's old. It's interesting if you're thinking that younger patients, did you say the older patients are not getting the fear and catastrophizing? Maybe.
So, yeah, Angela was saying that it's the younger patient starts at the fear stage, but not necessarily the older patients.
Yeah, that does mean that for younger patients, we do need to be turning up with better content. A lot of the time when I'm undertaking search report analysis for clients, the content that they create, which is fantastic and they've invested a lot in it, it's not turning up for these patients. And that's where that fear stage can be really bad, because it can send them spiraling into depression, because what they find is other blogs by other patients about all of their dramatic moments in their patient journey, and it can actually frighten someone even more. I think the other thing that happens as well with health is that if you've got something that's really worrying you, a lot of the time in the middle of the night, you're just finding that you can't sleep because you're lying there ruminating about it and worrying about it. And so you are turning online in the middle of the night to ask those questions as well. And you're in the dark, you're on your own, you're looking up on your phone about the symptom. You can really gravitate towards the scary content, and it can make you even more anxious. So if those younger patients are feeling fear at that early stage of the patient journey, I think as an industry, we need to do something where we turn up for them online, because once they get to the doctor's office, they can get that help, but there's all this other reality of their life where they also need help.
Great, thank you for answering that question. We've got a couple of other questions that have come through as well, but I'm not ignoring them. I'm going to save them till the end of the session, because they're great questions, but they're not necessarily about this particular slide that Julia's talking about. So we will get to those. It will just be at the end of the session. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, so this slide was just trying to illustrate how those stages of grief are overlaid with the patient journey. So for every single patient, it's going to be slightly different. And for different diseases, those emotions are going to play different levels of influence on that patient journey and the way that they respond to content. We talked about the denial and how people might lean into their optimism bias and brush off what could be a serious symptom. And in the book, actually, I've drawn from real questions that patients with prostate cancer and prostate cancer symptoms actually have asked into search engines to create a case study to illustrate how that might actually play out in a real person's life. The bargaining stage is really interesting, because that's where you can actually connect with newly diagnosed patients a lot of the time. So people might ask, oh, can my HIV test be wrong? Or can newly diagnosed diabetes be reversed? So they're bargaining. They're trying to find what they can do, or clinging to some kind of like hope that maybe there's a way that this reality that they're having to come to terms with is not real, or that they can make it go away. And they're looking for information on the acceptance phase. I think is really important as well, from the point of view when they are typing up the my disease, because that's where you see them go down into these digital rabbit holes, and they can get drawn into content by bloggers. There is one blog out there that people with cancer are drawn into, and before you know it, they're moved from clinically studied evidence-based medications onto a dogworming tablet and CBD oil and curcumin, because apparently that's going to cure their cancer. And working in healthcare and knowing how much rigor is going into the testing of medications, to think that someone is being given a link to buy something on Amazon for $7 to cure their cancer, and then being told that, oh, if that's out of stock, don't worry, you can buy this generic version. And then they're like, oh, if a dog that's 40 kilograms gets 2 tablets, then how many tablets should I take? I'm just like, oh my goodness. So understanding that patient information experience in your category and seeing where your patients are going is a really important thing as well. And I think we have a responsibility to do that. it's the work that you guys have done in search listening and giving me the opportunity to really study and analyze this that has led me to be able to shine a light on what was previously a blind spot in the digital information landscape for patients. And now that we can see it, I feel like we can't unsee it, and we have a responsibility to take it into account, whatever category we work in, and actually like address it proactively by turning up and responding, but also cleaning up the internet, because Google, as you guys have mentioned on an earlier webcast, has the your money in your life philosophy, which means that if something is going to impact someone's financial security or their health in a negative way, Google will engage with reports of that being misinformation. And the pandemic, of course, has really accelerated that as a category for misinformation, which has actually been really good, because it means that there's now a heightened interest and heightened awareness of the influence of misinformation from a health point of view. So you can report that and hopefully, you know, remove it from influencing patients in the future.
Thank you, guys. We've had a few really interesting questions through, actually. I don't know if anyone else wants to drop questions into the chat now as well. We will move on to questions in a second. I just wanted to remind you about Sophie and Julia's books. If you found what they've been saying tonight interesting, which I'm sure you have, it's been absolutely fascinating, then their books are available. I dropped the links in the chat earlier, and I will send them in the follow-up notes tomorrow as well. Move on to questions. So first of all, there's been a couple of questions about specific health-related issues, and I don't know if either of you have looked into pregnancy-related conditions. Has that been anything that you've worked on in terms of a search listening project?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps because there's another separate one as well, which is specifically to do with someone that's lost a tooth and is looking for a dental implant solution. But yeah, I wonder if, Sophie, perhaps you could give a bit of an overview on how people might start search lists around a particular issue or ailment when it comes to people's health.
Yeah, so I did see both of those and yeah, had some thoughts on them. I've not worked on anything directly around those myself either, but I certainly, obviously, Answer the Public is a very good place to start. But I think Julia mentioned it earlier, the word "my" in all of this is super telling, and particularly in that healthcare space. So is it Harold who's asking about someone who might have lost a tooth and be looking for a dental implant solution? I would be putting things like "my tooth" into Answer the Public. So the tip I always give people is to try and keep your seed terms that you put into Answer the Public quite short and snappy. You don't want to put, in that instance, if you were putting "I want a dental implant" in, you probably wouldn't get much back because you're being too prescriptive with what you're giving Answer the Public. So think about "my tooth." Maybe "tooth fallen" would be another one. People talking about their tooth falling out. So think about those very short, maybe two absolute 3-word max phrases that are relevant to the people. Again, the pregnancy one, I'd be thinking about things like "my fertility," my baby, "my pregnancy" would be really interesting. You absolutely could and should probably pop in the terms that would come to mind straight away. So "get pregnant" or "pregnancy." But I always really encourage, and I'm really pleased Julia mentioned it as well, to play around with the "my" word in all of that, because it really brings it home. If it's someone who's saying "lost my tooth" or "my baby" or "my pregnancy," you can be really certain that they are going through that thing, because they are literally telling you in the way that they're searching. So if you pop any of those phrases, so "my baby," "my fertility," "my pregnancy," "my tooth," "lost my tooth," into Answer the Public, I would confidently say that you should get an absolute ton of really interesting data, and all things along the journeys that we've talked about tonight, comparisons that people are making, or really raw emotional questions that they need reassurance about, or questions about medication, all of the things that we've touched. I think you'll get that, but just think about the seed terms that you put in, and always try and find a way of putting "my" in, particularly in that healthcare space, because it really segments the audience quite neatly for you, which makes your data more relevant and useful.
If you're looking for someone who's not yet pregnant, you could even put "get pregnant."
Yeah.
And then you'll probably find all of the questions around people wondering how they can get pregnant as well.
Yeah, really good shout. And it's really that, it's thinking about how your potential patient or audience, the person that you're trying to communicate with or reach out to, the language they might use. And I think, again, Julia touched on it earlier, but it's where, particularly if you work in the healthcare space or in a certain business where there is a lot of jargon in healthcare. If you think about yourself in your normal, outside of work, kind of real life, it's really important to think about the kind of language that everyday people might use and not take anything for granted. I think my favourite example that I discovered when me and Julia started digging into a little bit more of the data was people said, what does sexually active mean? Which actually, it's quite a risky example, but I suppose sexually active, it's not a particularly shrouded in mystery term. It's not a medical term, but actually you can totally appreciate that might be someone who sat there, as Julia said earlier, in a consultation with a healthcare professional who's asked them, are they sexually active? And probably out of embarrassment, the person hasn't felt able to stop there in that moment and say, sorry, what could you clarify specifically what you mean? So they've come away and they've turned to Google for it. And that one really strikes me, because actually sexually active isn't like some complex medication, a word that is completely foreign to people. It's just that they don't understand it. And actually in the healthcare context, it might be quite normal to ask someone if they're sexually active. But perhaps in the consumer world, less. When you're thinking about the terms that you're basing your search listening on and that you're putting into AnswerThePublic, you absolutely need to consider how the everyday person might talk about whatever it is that
it's often quite different from what we assume. Like when I take a brief from clients and we've got seed words that we've agreed, and then I start looking online, I'm like, there's nothing around that, or it's gone to a completely different category because there's like overlap in the way the words are used. And then sometimes through the blogs and things like that do come up, you can go, oh, maybe that word. And then you go back and then you find all of those questions and you go, wow, I didn't even know what that word was. But patients in that category, that's their language. And it's very different from what I guess us, either as healthcare professionals or in healthcare marketing, would assume that they use. And that's where search listening is just so illuminating, because we can take those insights that we learn online and apply them to our offline tools as well. This doesn't have to all be about digital marketing. This is about better understanding our stakeholders and connecting with them with the language that resonates, and also answering the questions that they really have, the burning questions that they feel are not being answered, and that's why they're turning to Google.
Yeah.
Great, thanks guys. There's another question here about accessibility for information. So I know we talked about kind of the ages of searchers earlier, but someone said about, do you have suggestions about accessibility for healthcare information? And they've said that what could be accessed can really skew perceptions. So I guess that's what you were talking about, Sophie, earlier when you were saying about this search data being anonymous. Like, how would you get around?
So I read from that question, it'd be good perhaps if the person, I'm sorry I've forgotten who it was who posted it, could just clarify. Sorry, I was wondering around that. Was that around disabilities and medical issues that might make it difficult to access information? Yeah, maybe if Victoria can sort of post in the chat, then we can elaborate a little bit more, because if that is the case, I've got some thoughts.
Yeah, okay, great. Cool. Okay, let's move on. So yeah, so someone's asked that they've said that they'd love AnswerThePublic to have a feature where you can see how people are searching at a global level instead of having to specify by location. I obviously work for AnswerThePublic, and that is not possible because you can only see Google's auto suggestion data, which is one of the sources that we use in AnswerThePublic by country. But they've asked how valuable a feature like that would be to your work, Julia. Do you think that would that help you?
A lot of the clients that I'm working with, like, they are focused on understanding the patients and the dynamics in their market. So who's turning up for those patients as digital opinion leaders potentially, so doctors who are talking on that subject. What are the resources that are coming back for those patients in terms of patient support groups, things like that? If there is a wider net that needs to be cast over things, and earlier in the pandemic, I was talking with some people at the ITU that work with the WHO on the infodemic that's arisen alongside the pandemic, and talking about how you might actually undertake this in different countries. I think as a starting place, like, you could actually just do an analysis in maybe 3 or 5 different countries and find the themes that are coming up there, because once you start looking, you'll see similarities as well. And then that will give you a bit of a guide from a global point of view on any given topic. You just need to spend the time maybe diving into different markets, but you'll also see the differences as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. There's quite a practical question here, which I don't know the answer to, but someone's asked if we put a star at the end of a term in Google, for instance, if they were to search addict with a star, is that supposed to search for any ending to the word addict? So like, for example, addiction or addicts?
Yeah, so that will in your actual Google search. So if you put that in the search bar and hit enter or click search and complete the search if you like, then that will give you Google search results around any of those things. It won't work in Answer the Public or in the Google suggestions bar, which is obviously where the Answer the Public data comes from, because it is literally reading the words that you're putting in. So it is very literal in terms of what you put in and what Google serves back, if you like, from your suggestions. So the asterisk trick won't work there, but it would obviously if you completed a search with that, you'd get a whole load of results that are relevant to all sorts of things. The tip that I can give you there, if you are wanting to do search listening in that way, is to remember that you can almost create what I often call wildcard. If you go into Google and obviously in a incognito or anonymous browser is the important thing here, so that it's not skewed by your own search history, and start typing in something. So you could put addict, you might put like addict recovery. If you went back and clicked on like the T at the end of addict and almost hit a space and then hit a space, you might then get some, like Google will try and fill the blanks. So you can put a sentence into Google, don't hit enter, let it think that it's still trying to serve up suggestions to you, and go back and put a space or deliberately leave space in a certain place in the sentence, and Google will try and fill those blanks. But the asterisk trick won't work if you're looking at Google suggestions.
Great, thanks, Sophie. Okay, so Victoria's come back, so I'll just go back to her original question. Do you have suggestions about accessibility for healthcare information? What can be accessed can really skew perceptions. And she's come back to say disabilities and access, for example, a site about ADHD that's hard for someone with ADHD to handle.
Yeah, so there's a few things here. I think one that massively speaks to something Julia said earlier, which is where she's worked with healthcare professionals in the past to create content. And you've had I think you said you've had the consumer writer, the medical writer, and perhaps a psychologist, but perhaps there's someone else in that mix, a specialist. Certainly if you're writing content that's meant to help and inform people who've got ADHD, you would hope that the organisation behind that are able to bring in an expert in it, so that I guess the structure or the functionality, whatever it is about the website, is built in a sort of ADHD friendly way. That would be a key thing for me. But I think the other thing is, don't forget that people don't only search by literally typing things in. So voice search is a really interesting area here for me. And those suggestions that we see in Answer the Public and in Google Suggests are voice suggestions as well. They're not just things that people have typed in. They might be things that someone has asked their Google device. I always have to be careful here because I'm sat in front of one and I don't want to trigger it. But yeah, I think about the fact that people might be searching with their voice, and the way that the best tip, and this is an SEO tip more so than a search listening tip, but typically when Google responds to a question, a search question that's been asked, when a Google Home device actually responds, it usually taps into what are called like the knowledge boxes in the search results. So typically if you'll search something in Google, particularly if it's a medical thing or a question, you might get a box that kind of appears at the top of the results before the more traditional search results further down the page. And that box is typically what Google will respond with. So it might say, according to the website X, here is the answer to your question. So I would really encourage you to try and get those answer boxes. The way that you get those answer boxes is to structure your content in a really search friendly way, and that is lots of questions and answers. And again, that's where Answer the Public would be really great. So if you put my ADHD into Answer the Public, you'd get a whole set of questions. My advice would be to create a web page per question, or a web page that captures all of those questions, and really clearly make the questions headers on the page, and then give a clear, succinct, 2-3 sentence answer to that question. That's giving you the best chance, alongside a whole host of other kind of SEO things. You need links into your website, it needs to be structured well, but that gives you the best chance of getting those knowledge boxes in the search results, and therefore being the answer that is voiced when someone searches with a speaker rather than searching with their hands and their eyes. So yeah, I guess don't think about search only as a visual thing. There's a whole host of other ways that people will access search results.
Yeah, and that, Sophie, is taking what is traditional SEO to the next level of basically search listening optimization, as I've termed it in my book, because it's about understanding the questions that people are actually asking. So for that site with ADHD, the stakeholders that you're trying to connect with and support, making sure that you have questions that they ask. So do you know what your patients don't know? And making sure that content is captured and included in your website. I guess testing it offline with people is really important as well, just to make sure that user functionality and the way that you've created that content, whether it's video or illustrations and graphics, or is there a chatbot mechanism in there, are they working for your stakeholders before you put it online? But the ultimate goal of making sure that it turns up for them where and when they need it, when they turn to Google for health advice, is by answering the right questions. And the way you just described it, Sophie, is exactly what I've discovered I really need to recommend to my clients, is this bite-sized content. So a lot of the time, and particularly this is for healthcare professionals, when they're asking, does this antibiotic treat that, for example, they just get pages of content. And I think about them, like when you think about triggers, it's not like they're on their lunch break or they're, on holiday and they're looking this up. There's someone sitting in front of them that needs an answer to that question right now. And they're either stepping out of the room and looking it up on their phone, in which case a lot of this stuff is not even mobile responsive, or they're looking it up in front of the patient and they start to get flustered when they can't find those answers. So having that question reiterated back to that stakeholder and then a really quick bite-sized answer that gives them what they need with options to click through to further information if they need it, I think is really going to be transformative to that healthcare professional information experience or that patient information experience. I did see someone, had a question about how do you know if it's a healthcare professional asking a question? Can I just touch on? When I first started out doing this, I was like, I actually don't know. But the more that I've actually studied the questions, it's become really clear because they will use different terminology. In an earlier conversation with Sophie, she talked about people asking, what does my doctor mean by? And that's where we stumbled across the sexually active thing. Doctors might talk about my patient, or they'll use the generic terms to refer to a medication as opposed to the brand name. They'll talk about with vaccines, for example, about how to give it, how to administer, how to reconstitute. So those are the kind of questions that are really not patient questions. So the more that you study the search query data, you'll be able to go, that's definitely not a patient and that's definitely not a doctor. And so it's just really spending time with the data.
And thinking about the language, I think, is the key thing. Like you said, the one that always strikes me is the contraindicated, or those sorts of terms that I, as someone who doesn't really do a lot of work in the healthcare space, would never know that. But I can imagine the professional is quite comfortable using that kind of language.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question that's quite similar to that one, actually, but it's more to do with the difference in search patterns of patients and their relatives. So what this person's saying is that the relatives should ideally find the same source of answers. From a company's perspective, and would you suggest paying attention to relatives as a target groups or just concentrate on the patients themselves? I'm sure we've all been in an experience where we've had a friend, family member or loved one that's had some news that we've wanted to research ourselves, and should people like us, even if we're not the person that's got the medical condition, should we be targeted too?
I think if you are just listening to the questions around the relevant seed terms in that category and creating content that turns up in response to them, so you can set KPIs. If you're measuring that information experience and you're seeing what's coming up at the moment is not really serving the needs of that patient segment, then you can time how your content that you're designing in response to that question starts turning up. Then you will be turning up for all of the stakeholders that you need to, whether they be a carer or a patient themselves. And that with different diseases that manifest in childhood as well, a lot of parents are asking questions. And my child is another really good one to bring into queries around a particular category, if you're looking for the carer.
I'd be really intrigued to look at all my sister, my husband has, my brother has, my child has, those sorts of seeds, and Answer the Public and see what's coming back. Or if you know what disease or issue it is that you're looking at, I'd probably jump into Google Suggests at that point and maybe do a my has cancer, whatever it is, and go back and put that space that I was talking about in between the my and the has. What I would expect is that Google would populate a list of almost the people who are most frequently searching when someone else in their world has that thing. It's quite a good use of the kind of wildcard tactic, as I call it, because you'll if you know the condition disease and you put that my and has, your Google will fill that list for you, which will give you a good insight into who actually is engaging with search in that world.
That's a great tip, thank you. So Nikki's asking here, for a long time they've been looking for a way to segment search data, for example, to look at patients in lower socio-economic groups for public sector projects. Is there a way to do that, or what advice would you give in that scenario?
Yeah, this one. So back in the day, there previously was a tool that you could use that did exactly that, or at least married up search data with more demographic data, all anonymized still, but that tool ceased to exist maybe 3 years ago now, which broke my heart a little bit, because it was really the one tip I'd give there, perhaps around the lower socioeconomic groups. I always think this is an interesting thing to explore, particularly around like age groups. But whenever I talk about search listing, you'll most often hear me talking about Google, because certainly in the Western world it is by far and away the dominant search engine, but clearly Bing exists, and Julia mentioned Bing earlier. The interesting thing with Bing, and it's not a complete exact science, if you like, but a lot of devices, obviously non sort of Google Chromebooks and things like that are out the window, but a lot of devices come with, or like older laptops will come with Bing like preloaded as the default search engine. So there is an interesting thing there. I would encourage you to explore differences that you see in search suggestions in Bing versus in Google. And you'd need to do that in the two search engines directly. Obviously AnswerThePublic doesn't let you determine where your data is coming from. But yes, it's not an exact science, as I said, but I would be inclined to say that at least in Bing, you would be getting suggestions from probably an older, potentially lower socioeconomic group. It's somewhat generalized, but it's potentially people who are less tech savvy, who are going to stick with Bing as the kind of default search engine. I guess there's other search engines now like Ecosia, and I think DuckDuckGo. So Ecosia, they plant a tree for every search that's made. So I guess if you were particularly interested in people who were quite planet minded, then you might look at what suggestions Ecosia is making, because that again should be based on people using that site. And the same for DuckDuckGo. So DuckDuckGo has more privacy effectively when you do the search, so less tracking of you. You might be able to explore that to find people who are particularly preoccupied with privacy online. But yeah, Bing versus Google would be an interesting thing to explore, and probably the best way to do that in the absence of any definite tools.
And maybe looking to understand their questions about cost as well, because Sophie, I know that in your training and in your book, you have a whole section on that about people searching for a particular service under a certain price. Yeah. And so you can see the price points that they picked in their mind. They want to find whatever tooth extraction under $100 or things like that, or they might look for coupons, or they might look for social services or charities that offer those services. Yeah, or they might self-diagnose and then look to buy the medication directly online that they think they need, because certainly there are always links out there to buy anything, which is scary. Yeah, I'm talking about prescription medications. So those kind of angles in to connect with those lower socioeconomic groups might be another technique that you could apply.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We are out of time. I'm just going to ask one more question. I'm sorry for anyone whose question we haven't had time to get to, but obviously you can drop a message to the guys on Twitter if there was something that you really wanted us to answer. But just the last one, I think this is more of an opinion question, but it's interesting. So do you think for medical content, do you feel content should be created by hospitals, medical societies, or from governments, which is possibly more of an authentic group that patients would trust? I know you touched on this earlier, didn't you, Julia, when you were talking about the cancer medication? It was actually something for dogs, wasn't it? Like, what are your thoughts on that as a professional in this?
I actually did a survey last year on trying to understand the sources of information that people would find most trustworthy, and doctors' groups that publish content online, so like the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic and things like that, very highly. And so any doctors' group that's able to put out a position or provide information to patients that is discoverable online in response to their questions is highly trusted. The other thing is institutions like universities and things like that, medical schools, and then industry as well, right up there. So people do expect and trust content that comes from the companies that study these diseases and create the medications designed to treat them. and they will trust that content as well. The main thing is just finding a way to make sure that it turns up, because that's where you get that return on investment in information. We've got the road in Australia called the Nullarbor. It's in the middle of nowhere and it goes a really long way. And a lot of the time I feel like all of that investment that goes into creating these websites for the amount of valuable traffic that you get to those websites off of the back of a real world question by an actual patient, you may as well be putting a billboard on the Nullarbor. So yeah, so I think that's hopefully a bit of an insight into that.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I can recall, so we did a webinar, Sam Gilbert, who has also done some really interesting stuff with search listening in a kind of not-for-profit space. And I was talking to him a lot during the very early days of lockdown in the UK. And I think it was him who pointed out an instance where, I can't remember what the question, there was a question around coronavirus, and it was a commercial radio station in the UK that had the top result, and therefore the one that people are going to click on, because we're all lazy, we don't tend to scroll down Google. It's why those top spots in Google are coveted. And yeah, and it strikes, it's a few things there. One, I guess Google has the responsibility to ensure that it is rewarding those top spots with people who genuinely can provide the answers, which might be the sorts of organisations that you'd talked about. In theory, the your money, your life kind of guidelines that, again, Julia mentioned earlier, mean that is what should happen. It doesn't happen in every single instance. And another interesting point there, I think, is it's really important for whoever wants to be the authority in this space to be recognising that search behaviour changes all the time. Again, if you go on searchlistening.com, you'll see we did some interesting tracking around vaccinations and top search questions around vaccinations when they first started rolling out in the UK, and how they were changing day by day and the questions that people were asking. And yeah, you'll see stuff change all the time, but you need to be tracking, which is one of the great features of Answer the Public. You need to be tracking the really pertinent searches in your world. Don't look at search listening and this kind of research as a one-off. I've done it, that's my box, I've done it, I know everything there is to know now, because I can guarantee you next month, in 6 months, there's going to be a whole other set of questions that people are asking. If you can be the organisation that spots those new searches, which, as I said, you can do by tracking in Answer the Public, you can be the first people to create that content. And I hope the people we've got in the room right now are the sort of trustworthy sites that deserve to be providing those answers. But yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for someone. I think largely Google gets it right in terms of who it ranks there, but equally organisations' strategies and ability to monitor search behaviour needs to develop and come on, and that's why I'm so sort of passionate about search listening, and so thankful that Julia's really picked it up in this kind of healthcare space, because there's such an opportunity for worthwhile organisations to help more people.
Yeah, and I'm still seeing that all the time. Top questions in a category around health, where there are major players who invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in creating assets that serve the needs of patients and doctors, and the top search result or the snippet will be based off of a news article. I saw that yesterday. It really blows my mind. It shows that not only have we got a lot of work to do, but the positive thing is there's a huge opportunity to really improve this information experience in healthcare. And like you said, Sophie, it's an active process. It's one that you want to engage with. It's not one and done, because over time you will want to track those emerging queries as the market changes, competitors come out, recalls might happen, new indications might get approved, but also to track as a KPI how the responses are changing for those patients. The collaborators, like maybe it is a university that you've worked with to create better content, is that actually starting to turn up in response to those real world questions?
Great. Thank you so much, guys. That was a brilliant question to finish on. And I'm sure everyone that is still in the room, there's still loads of you here, have taken a lot from that. I will also send in the follow-up notes the piece that Sophie was talking about just then, so where they were tracking search terms. It's really interesting. It's a great visual as well. And I'll send some information about how you can track and Answer the Public too. You've all signed up for the webinar, so as we mentioned earlier, you will get a recording. It'll be in your inbox tomorrow. And we do run these webinars regularly, so we're just working on the details for the next one. But as you guys have all registered as well, you will get a link to sign up for that one. So hopefully we'll see some of your faces back on that next webinar. But also, check out our YouTube channel. Everything will be on there, including this webinar, plus all of our previous webinars. And you can get to them as well from Answer the Public if you click on Learn on the top nav on the right-hand side of the website. All of the content is there. Anything that you wanted to chat to the guys about, don't forget to get in touch with them on Twitter. I'll share their handles again in the follow-up email. Or LinkedIn as well. I'll send the LinkedIn details, and I will send you the links to the book as well. So you get a nice little email tomorrow with all the information from the webinar in it. So a huge thank you, Julia and Sophie, for being here again. It was another fascinating session.
Thank you. So lovely to see you both, and thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks for everyone who's in the room. It's great to have you all here. See you later, guys.
Bye.